Continuing with our series of what ifs, today we're going to take a look at the beloved Commodore 128. And while nobody could argue that the Commodore 128 wasn't a sales success, having sold somewhere around 5 million units, it wasn't a success in every regard. Many features of the computer were seldomly used, such as the CPM mode, or the 80-column video, or, I hate to say it, the native C128 mode as well. And while the C128 is still one of my favorite computers ever, the reality is the vast majority of them were booted into C64 mode day after day because there wasn't much software developed for the native system. So in this video, another alternate universe exploration, I want to pose a what-if scenario about the C128. Since the sales success of the machine isn't so much in question, what I wanted to focus on are possible changes that might have resulted in more dedicated software being written for the machine. And I didn't want these changes to be unreasonable, requiring massive amounts of engineering. I wanted them to be simple changes. What I've come up with might surprise you. I should also start by mentioning that development for the 128 was happening in 1984, alongside development for the Amiga. And so naturally the Amiga was considered the future, and they didn't want to produce a machine that might cannibalize sales of that. But for the sake of argument for this alternate universe, let's assume there was no Amiga in development. So part of what we want to look at isn't so much the end user who's going to buy the computer. What we want to look at are the software companies that were making C64 software at the time. Now from their perspective, they always want to develop for the lowest common denominator because that'll give them the biggest market and return on their development. And that's why we never saw games that required RAM expanders or even things like a mouse. And even though the 1571 and 1581 existed, almost no commercial software was ever distributed on these disk formats because there were still 128 users who were using a standard 1541 disk drive, and they wanted to make sure even the lowest configuration would work. I chatted with several C128 enthusiasts, and we discussed various changes such as having stereo SID chips for 6-voice sounds, or a better UART so faster modems could be used, and one thing we discussed was a better interface to the 80-column chip so that the CPU could directly write to video RAM. We also discussed if maybe they had moved to the 65816 CPU and made the machine 16-bit. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be possible because that chip didn't even become available until 1985, after the C128 would have already started shipping. And while all of these things would have improved the machine, there's one specific change I'm going to fixate on. I'm going to make the case that simply integrating a 1581 disk drive into the 128 would have had a long-lasting, dramatic effect. It could have been configured as device 9 by default, and that way you could still connect a 1541 as drive number 8 for compatibility with C64 software. Now, you think that idea is crazy? Apparently Commodore didn't think so. Take a look at these prototypes that were designed. This is a Commodore 128D prototype that has a built-in 1581. But this thinking wasn't limited to just the D version. Take a look at this. They sort of bolted one on top of the flat 128, although it's pretty ugly looking in my opinion. Here's another one that sort of popped up as needed from the center. This is also very ugly in my opinion. However, the last prototype here is actually pretty cool looking. Just the aesthetics alone would have had me going bonkers over this machine. But there's a big concern. What about cost? I can't tell you exactly what such a machine would have cost, but I can speculate. The original C128 cost $299, but was later sold for less, such as in 1987 it was going for $249, even $199 when bundled with other equipment. And the 1581 was very expensive when it first appeared, selling for $399, but that price dropped quickly. For example, in 1989 it was being sold for $189. And let's not forget, Commodore made the 128D with the built-in 1571 disk drive, and that machine retailed for $499, and later for $439. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that building this machine would have bumped the price up to maybe $399 or even $450. However, that wouldn't necessarily raise the price barrier for consumers. I mean, let's face it. At least here in the USA, almost all Commodore computers were bought with a disk drive anyway, at minimum a 1541. Okay, so every C128 is shipping with a built-in 3.5-inch disk drive. I mean, what would this affect the decision of software developers? Well, for one thing, that means the default storage capability of the machine is now 800K instead of 170K. As such, developers wouldn't be afraid to tap into that. And don't forget, disk access would be lightning fast compared to the 1541. So games like Maniac Mansion were painfully slow to load when walking to a different screen and often required disk swapping. For example, Zack McCracken needed 3 disks, one to boot the game, and then 2 sides of another disk for the data. And then the user needed their own disk to save the game. This could easily fit on a single 1581 disk. Now, Ultima 5, for example, came on 4 disks, although really more like 8 since you had to flip the disks over. Now, this could have been condensed to 2 disks, which would have still made life a lot easier. But besides making C64 games work better, let's imagine the games we never got. Now, what about The Secret of Monkey Island? Now, believe it or not, this is a homebrew I'm showing you that cuts the game engine down to mostly a text adventure with still shots from the game and music. But I'm convinced with 128K and more storage, we could have had the real deal. Likewise, I suspect we could have had other adventure games from Sierra like Space Quest or King's Quest. After all, the Apple II could run these games with 128K, so no reason the C128 couldn't. Now, these screenshots are mock-ups I made in a paint program that conformed to the 128's video capabilities using a combination of automated conversions with some manual touch-ups. Now, here's another mock-up. Populous was one of my favorite games, and I'm convinced the C128 could run it with this configuration. Here's another one, Worms. And what about Eye of the Beholder? Now, this is from a modern port of the game to the C64, so there's no question about the graphics, but it does require an Easy Flash, which is a modern cartridge with a lot of onboard storage. But I think it should be possible for something like this to work on a C128 and a 1581 without the Easy Flash. Likewise, Prince of Persia was ported to the C64 back in 2011, but also requires an Easy Flash. But again, I'm convinced this would have been possible on a C128 without any extra hardware. After all, the Apple II can run the game on a stock system with 128K. I suspect another world would also be possible, although it might be tight. So I asked Burger Becky, who did the Apple II GS and SNES port of the game, and she said it would probably work on a C128 at 10 to 15 frames per second. Even something like Golden Axe might also be possible, although it's a bit of a stretch due to the size of the sprites, which would have to be rendered in software. And then there's Sonic the Hedgehog. A C64 version came out a few years ago, which is what you're seeing here, but it does require a RAM expander. Now granted, Sega would have probably never allowed this game on a different platform anyway, so the idea is probably moot, but it's still interesting to think about that a game similar to this could have been done. And we can speculate all day about games that didn't exist, but another interesting angle to speculate about is games that already existed but might have been better. Ultima 5 is a great example. It's one of the few games that actually did have native support for the 128, and the main benefit of the 128 version is the faster disk access and of course the inclusion of music, which was left out on the C64 version due to lack of RAM. Unfortunately, it didn't support the 1581 disk drive, which would have made the game even better by reducing all of the disk swapping. Another interesting example is my own game, Attack of the Petsky Robots. The C64 version is quite playable and charming for sure, and it runs just fine on a C128, but just by using the extra storage and RAM available on the C128, the game looks dramatically different. And this is another angle I'd like to tackle. I suspect a lot of games that already existed and were already pretty good on the C64 might could have been improved with better graphics, better musical soundtracks, and so forth. Ghostbusters is a great example. It was already a great game on the C64, but add more RAM and maybe it could have looked like this. This is actually a screenshot from a work-in-progress remake of the original game on the C64. I started work on a Spy vs. Spy mock-up, but this is as far as I got, but you get the idea. Of course, people might be asking about software other than games, and that's a fair question to ask. Now, there were a number of productivity applications written for the Commodore 128. Most of them are easily forgettable these days, but one piece of software that everyone remembers, of course, was GEOS 128. Taking proper advantage of the extra RAM, the high-res graphics of the 80-column display, and fast disk access from a 1581, GEOS 128 was much more usable than the Commodore 64 version. And later on, in the 1990s, there were a number of improvements made to GEOS, such as wheels, shown here. Of course, by this point, Commodore had already been liquidated, and 8-bit machines were already more of a novelty than a serious computer. But honestly, I've never been that fond of GEOS's architecture. In fact, check this out. This is a mock-up I did of Amiga Workbench, or rather something that looked very similar to Amiga Workbench that could have existed on the C128. With the MMU, it should have been possible to have preemptive multitasking just like the Amiga did. The color is a bit of a mixed bag because with color cells you have more than 4 colors like the Amiga had in Workbench, but you couldn't put the colors very close together though, so I suspect if they had poured the resources into developing this on the C128 instead of the Amiga, I think it could have happened. I mean, seriously, imagine this coming out a year after the Macintosh debuted, only the C128 would have been color and about 20% the cost of a Macintosh. Going this route, I believe Commodore could have built a better upgrade path, not just for C64 users, but also for 128 users. For example, a few years later, they might have gone with the 816 processor, increasing it to a 16-bit machine, perhaps even bumping up the clock speed a little bit here and there. I could see this technology taking them well into the 1990s. However, I suspect they would have still succumbed to the proliferation of cheap clone IBM-compatible computers. However, if Commodore had millions of users running their Workbench operating system, they could have ported that to the PC. And of course, they had their own PC computers as well. So they could have perhaps brought all those users into the PC world with them and had a successful graphical operating system well before Microsoft Windows ever really took hold. But that is maybe a discussion for another alternate universe video. Knowing that the Commodore brand was recently acquired by Parafractic and a handful of investors, I'm going to throw in a challenge and see if they could actually build a modern version of this amazing looking machine, the one that should have been, the one that could have changed Commodore's future. I'd certainly put my money down to buy one. But that's all for now. As always, thanks for watching.